Dr. Peter Andover is very interested in treating phobias and fear. He eventually finds a technology that allows him to treat patients with severe fears affecting their daily lives. The doctor has always been very interested in the concept of fear, trying to find a way to change how people can approach their lives past the fear they feel. The doctor explicitly targets treatment of the amygdala, utilizing it to inhibit fear in his patients, and his therapy is built around making his patients hallucinate their fears and eventually overcome them. The treatment is revolutionary. One of his patients, Paige, falls victim to a diner shooting. The machine puts the woman back into her traumatic event. A black-masked shooter enters a diner, immediately shooting diners left and right. Eventually, the shooter walks over to Paige, shooting the man behind her, but leaving her alive. Paige now leaves her hallucination, finding herself inside an empty abyss. She turns around in this abyss to find a door. Eventually, another voice starts, giving Paige instructions, and the doctor can no longer communicate with her. He tries to shout at her, but Paige does not respond until she finally opens her eyes. The doctor opens the chamber to check on her, but she is unresponsive, stuck inside her fear forever. This brings the treatments to an abrupt end. Another victim of the diner shooting is Sarah. She is in a room in the diner when the masked shooter walks in and starts shooting the lights out individually. With each light shot down, Sarah screams. But the diner incident was just a recollection of the past. Sarah then wakes up from her nightmare, realizing the electricity in her house is out. She takes a flashlight and goes to the living room. Megan then starts knocking at the door, asking about Sarah's electricity. Neither has electricity at their place, so Megan decides to barge in. She asks Sarah to check her neck for bed bugs. Megan feels irritation behind her neck, but Sarah finds nothing. The electricity finally comes back, and Sarah kicks her friend out so she can go back to sleep. Sarah walks back into her bedroom, turning the lights off so she can go to sleep. With the room completely dark, she notices her closet light is still switched on, so she opens it to switch it off. She reaches for the light, only for the masked shooter to appear from the closet and start shooting rounds at her. However, Sarah is hallucinating, eventually returning to reality. She realizes that she is seeing things as a result of her trauma, something that has happened in the past, so she calls Dr. Andover. Dr. Andover, however, does not reply, even though he knows someone is trying to reach him and the two seem to have a history together. Sarah goes to the fear clinic the next day. No one answers the front door, but she hears Bauer screaming on his phone in his office. She decides to check on him. Bauer is on the phone, arguing and shouting at someone. The fear clinic seems to be in shambles, with no patients and the staff unresponsive. Sarah's snooping adventure stops when Megan calls her and alerts Bauer that someone is watching him. Sarah walks away from the office and discloses her location to Megan. Sarah walks in through another entrance. She cuts her call with Megan and starts sneaking her way in. She looks for the doctor inside and calls out to him. She eventually reaches the doctor's working space, but sees no one inside. She remembers her experience with the fear chamber as she inspects the treatment device in the middle of the room. The doctor helped her with her past trauma from the diner shooting, an event that caused her great distress. Sarah then crosses into another room, still calling out for the doctor. The doctor emerges from a bathtub in the middle of the room, completely. He startles Sarah, who does not expect him to be there. Dr. Andover's crew comes in to take the doctor away. Bauer and Osborne leave as they look at Sarah, but do not comment on her uninvited entry. They then escort the doctor outside, wrapping his hips in a towel. Sarah leaves the room and sees Dylan at the entrance. He is asking for Sarah's help. The two know each other and catch up in a few seconds until Dylan asks that Sarah help him get Kaylee, his wife, inside the clinic. Sarah talks to Kaylee, but Kaylee is entirely out of it. Dylan leaves to get something to drink, letting Kaylee and Sarah catch up. Sarah wants to know why Kaylee needs to be in the fear clinic again, but Kaylee knows that even Sarah is having withdrawal of her fears. Sarah is confused at first, but Kaylee does not give a response, instead puking out black liquid all over Sarah. Sarah shouts for help, when eventually Osborne instructs Bauer to get Kaylee prepped for examination. The treatment machine, or the fear chamber, is inside the attic, covered in dust and abandoned. Sarah and Osborne catch up outside the fear clinic. Sarah's fear of returning to haunt her is strange for the clinic, with treatment never requiring a second visit from a patient. For some reason, the doctor avoids interacting with his past patients, but Sarah is more curious about the bathtub that the doctor popped out from. The doctor's bathtub ritual is common practice for his treatments, one of his ways to prepare for the procedure. When asked about the black liquid Kaylee hurled over Sarah, Osborne reveals that Paige had also gotten treatment before. Meanwhile, the doctor is back at the machine, taking a sample of the black liquid spilled over it. Outside, the two are still arguing about the treatment. Paige's second treatment led to something terrible happening to her, decommissioning the machine until there was an answer for the strange occurrence. Osborne does not explain what happened to Paige, but Sarah does not care, as she is concerned for her fellow victim Kaylee. Osborne looks at Kaylee in one of the examination rooms. Dylan, meanwhile, is watching a television show on his tablet, waiting for the procedure. The checkup finishes, and the doctor leaves the room with Dylan. Outside the examination room door, Osborne explains that Kaylee's fear is tremendously affecting her health. Dylan is concerned for his wife, demanding that the doctor treat her directly. Osborne tries to dissolve his anger, but Dylan wants to ensure his girlfriend gets better. Sarah now decides to stay at the clinic until Kaylee is treated, so Osborne escorts her to a vacant room. In the examination room, Kaylee is talking to herself or someone in her imagination. She has done something for someone from her imagination in exchange for an unexplained demand. Dr. Andover is in his lab, about to add something to his research logs about Paige Peters. He stops and goes for a drink until he is interrupted by Sarah. The two talk about Paige, with the doctor shaken up by his patients struggling with their fears again. Sarah keeps pushing him into talking about Paige and revealing why he will not offer a second session for the patients. Eventually, the doctor complies, bursting the bubble of confidentiality that the clinic employees have kept up until now. After Paige's failed treatment, her body stopped moving entirely. Oddly enough, Paige was still alive, but in a strange and unnatural state where she required no oxygen or sustenance for survival. Her body remained in a state of fear until the doctor eventually decided to shut her eyes, leaving her soulless. With Paige's passing, the doctor could not let more patients get a second treatment, unable to handle further grief from losing a patient. Sarah is about to take her leave, but she points out one more thing to the doctor before exiting. She mentions Kaylee is vomiting out the black liquid the doctor is examining. Regardless of the doctor's involvement, the treatment will happen, with Sarah and Osborne leading the way. Bauer and the electrician are working on fixing the power supply. The electrician is struggling, but Bauer eventually pushes him into trying again, with Osborne promising them a handsome sum for their work. Kaylee is lying down in the examination room with Dylan by her side. She is in a bad condition, but eventually snaps at Dylan when he says she might not be able to use the fear chamber. This news angers her and prompts her into blackmailing Dylan, who then assures her that he will manage something. Sarah throws on some clothes, trying to pick out a new shirt. She takes off her shirt, but starts to feel uneasy. Suddenly, a strange creature shows its face beside her, and the lights go off. The lights start flickering while Sarah is standing in her place. Stunned, the doctor is still in his office, looking at the black liquid sample he procured from the machine before. He grabs the syringe and places a drop of the black liquid underneath a microscope. He looks at the liquid, examining particles moving quickly through the lens. As he inspects the liquid through the microscope, he seems to drop a little bit of the black liquid on the counter, spilling and making its way to the doctor's finger. With the liquid touching the doctor, it forces him into a state of delusion. He is in a place with snow covering the ground but flying upwards. Eventually, he notices the fear chamber beside him, with hands crawling around the machine. Paige walks out from behind the chamber. The doctor asks her questions, but Paige begins talking about something different. Paige is not before the doctor, but some entity is taking her shape. The entity explains that the fear chamber is a door, allowing the creature to go from the world of delusions to reality. The entity then bends backward, before creepily sending off the doctor with a smile. In the real world, Dr. Andover slowly regains his composure after being shaken up by the hallucination. He then writes down his experience touching the black liquid under his examination of Paige, mentioning its hallucinogenic property. Kaylee and Dylan are sleeping together, but Kaylee wakes up in the middle of the night. She walks away from the bedroom and leaves towards the corridor. Turning on the lights, she walks towards the fear chamber in the room before him. She talks to the machine, asking it some disconnected question. She treats the machine as a natural person with wants and desires, assuring it that she will comply with the imaginary person's wishes. Kaylee goes out for a smoke break. She then starts thinking about her past. She is sitting on a bench and watching her brother Kevin. Suddenly, Dylan surprises her from behind and joins her, suggesting that the family go and eat together. Kevin then joins them as they start talking about a show Dylan was a part of. The family speaks for a bit, until they decide to get a milkshake from the diner. Kaylee is now looking at herself inside her flashback, regret showing all across her face. Kaylee snaps out of her flashback to the sound of a gunshot from the electrician shooting down a squirrel. The hunter apologizes, but Kaylee does not respond and re-enters the house. Sarah wakes up in the morning and hears an announcement from the PA system. She walks to the main lobby, where Mrs. Patton and her son are brought into the living room. Blake Patton is paralyzed and unable to speak due to his trauma in the same diner as the other victims in the house. He also has irreversible brain damage as a consequence. Osborne checks him once, eventually asking Bauer to escort the man to an office. Sarah and Mrs. Patton sit together and talk about the clinic. Sarah talks about how she was treated for her fear of the dark, crediting the doctor for fixing her. Mrs. Patton then shares that her son is seeing something at night, causing him to get greatly frightened. Mrs. Patton does not expect the fear clinic to be helpful with his physical impairments, but she hopes that treatment lets her son find peace at night. The doctor is looking through the security cameras at the clinic. He eventually sees Osborne and Sarah talking, so he decides to eavesdrop. Osborne and Sarah argue about Blake's treatment. Osborne hesitates to use the fear chamber, but the current circumstances make it difficult. Eventually, she gets angry and leaves the room, Dr. Andover still watching as she goes. Osborne approaches Dr. Andover as he looks at the fear chamber. She talks about how she prepared the device for patients who desperately need it, but Dr. Andover is still scared of using the fear chamber again. She convinces him, demanding that he consider the need for the machine and its success in the past over the one failure he has experienced. Osborne keeps insisting, but leaves the room and asks that the doctor believes in his life's work. Bauer is escorting Mrs. Patton to the basement where the fear chamber is situated. Inside the treatment room, Blake is already inside the machine, ready to be operated on. Osborne takes Mrs. Patton out of the doctor's way as he prepares to resume his practice. The procedure begins, and the machine again sends Blake into his traumatic event. Blake goes through the diner shooting event in his mind, with the doctor trying desperately to keep Blake focused on the treatment. However, Blake's heart rate skyrockets, alerting the doctors that there might be an issue with Blake's reception of the treatment. Something goes wrong with the treatment, and the procedure stops. Mrs. Patton approaches her son, but Bauer removes her from the room. The doctors inspect Blake's condition to check for any repercussions to the strange change in Blake's vital. After the treatment, they bring Blake's wheelchair and take him out. Blake is still breathing heavily, clearly bothered by his experience in the fear chamber. Bauer finds Sarah trying to contact Megan, but Megan is not responding to her friend. She asks Bauer for a car, but Bauer jokes with her instead. Dr. Andover comes into the room, asking what the fuss is about. Megan has been unresponsive for 6 hours, so the doctor sends Bauer to go pick Megan up. Bauer complies, apologizing for his actions prior, as it seems he holds the doctor with respect. The following day, Kaylee and Dylan have breakfast outdoors. Dylan does not believe in the fear chamber as a safe treatment, but Kaylee describes how the fear chamber is foolproof and essential. Dylan believes it to be unnatural, as fear is vital for someone's personal development and survival. They all argue, with Dylan bothered by how the doctor has free reign over his patients' minds. Eventually, he discloses being a patient, but is not sold on the doctor's practices. Regardless, Sarah tries to talk about Dylan's fear, but he diverts the conversation into an insensitive comment about Blake's paralysis. An awkward moment ensues, but Sarah decides just to take Blake away. As Sarah tries to Blake back inside, he stops the wheelchair from moving on his own. Everyone pauses for a while as Blake stares at Dylan for his backhanded comment. Sarah moves his hands back and takes him back inside. The doctor is still watching over everyone in the facility through cameras. Megan is sleeping in her room, but wakes up to the sound of a bell. Bauer shocks her and tells her he is there to pick her up. He takes her to the fear clinic, sharing some sarcastic comments with her, before she goes inside and leaves him in the car to listen to his heavy metal music. Sarah greets her friend at the door. They walk further inside the clinic as Megan mentions having the same fear symptoms as the rest of the returned patients. Inside their room, Dylan is getting ready to shower. Dylan plans to shower during her treatment, to which Kaylee asks him to come closer so that she can kiss him. Despite wanting to go in from the beginning, she is scared about what might happen in the fear chamber. The doctor is finally treating Kaylee. He walks her through the procedure and takes her back to the incident. In her hallucination, she goes through many different experiences all at once. She experiences fear from the diner, grief at her brother's tombstone, and joy from spending time with Dylan and Kevin. However, the doctor keeps redirecting her into thinking about the diner incident. While Kaylee has gone through the procedure before, the hallucination overwhelms her. The experience is too much for Kaylee. She demands to be let out, to which the doctor complies. Kaylee screams at everyone in her mania, complaining that the experience should not have been this harsh on her. Eventually, she mentions that a specific person promised the fear chamber would not cause her stress. She is talking about the same imaginary entity she has been talking to inside the facility. The electrician tries to help her, but the angry woman pushes him away and leaves the chamber. Osborne closes it as the doctor realizes that the entity attempted to communicate directly with Kaylee. Blake is in his room alone when Sarah knocks and comes in. The room is dark, with one lamp lighting a corner. Sarah sits down across from Blake as she comforts the man before her. Blake starts drawing something on paper, but Sarah interrupts and opens up about herself. Sarah enjoys talking about her fear, something that is not common among the other patients at the clinic. She talks about her experience at the diner, explaining her fear of the dark, but also explaining a side of her that thinks the procedure is wrong. Blake then talks, for the first time since his brain injury. He tries to comfort Sarah. Sarah is ecstatic about his effort to speak with her, but her conversation with him is interrupted by Osborne. Osborne asks Sarah to meet the doctor. Sarah leaves, with Osborne following soon after. The door closes to reveal a mutilated monster, and Blake's night terrors begin as his necrophobia shows him the bodies of the many victims from the diner. Dylan and Kaylee make love in their room after the treatment. After their session ends, Kaylee is mad at Dylan because he refuses to cause her pain during their time in bed. She asks him to leave, then seems distressed and alone inside the room. Sarah and the doctor are talking about Blake. Sarah thinks that there is a miracle on their hands. The doctor is worried that Blake's improved brain function is something unforeseen and concerning, but Sarah keeps trying to see the positive side. The argument gets heated when the doctor starts expressing his fear that the machine is doing more than it is supposed to. Blake is sleeping in his room, but wakes up and starts shouting into thin air. His mother comes to his aid, as the man is clearly suffering. The doctor explains the working of the fear chamber. It is supposed to target the amygdala, but Blake's brain damage involved damage to the frontal lobe. As a result, it makes no sense that Blake has improved function. The doctor asks that Sarah not judge him for what he thinks, but apparently, he thinks that there is some unexplainable entity trying to do something to his patients. He then points out that improved brain function will let him feel more fear as a side effect. Blake is drawing on his paper as his begin again. He sees a mutilated woman eating, as food barely goes into her torn mouth and blood pours out. Osborne is inspecting a bump on Megan's back. Ensuring everything is okay, Osborne cuts through the mass on her shoulder. Megan starts to struggle more and more as Osborne keeps cutting through. Osborne inspects the liquid coming out, finding that it is the same black liquid that Kaylee puked out before. Spiders then crawl out of the hole inside Megan and reach a strange pod inside the fear clinic. Sarah goes to see Blake again. He talks with her as she gets ready to have a conversation. She asks about his memory of the diner shooting. He talks about his flashbacks, but gets frustrated when Sarah pushes him and tries to ask about his mother. Blake loses his temper with Sarah, but eventually apologizes and reconciles with her. The electrician is checking the circuitry inside different patient rooms in the clinic. Suddenly, a man in a black mask appears behind him, frightening him immensely. Bauer shows himself behind the mask, laughing at his coworker for jumping at the sight. The lights start to flicker, and the electrician is a bit confused as to what is happening. The electrician acknowledges that an incoming storm will warrant emergency lighting anyway, so the current electricity issue can wait to be resolved. The two men are then interrupted in their inspection by a woman screaming, so they leave the room and the mask remains on the bed. The doctor talks to Blake about his condition. Blake can talk to the doctor, explaining how he is feeling better. The doctor then tries discovering more about the entity through Blake's experience in the fear chamber. He notices Blake's drawing on the desk. Realizing that Blake is still scared of the mask of the shooter, he tries to talk to Blake about the mask, attempting to convince him of his fear. The doctor then wants Blake to recall the event precisely from his perspective. The doctor keeps asking questions, pressing him to explain everything in detail, but Blake gets more and more angry with him and refuses to give answers. Bauer interrupts them, asking for the doctor's assistance with something. The doctor makes one last attempt at finding out more from Blake before leaving the room. Bauer informs him that there is something wrong with Megan in the basement. The doctor and Osborne are about to conduct another treatment inside the fear chamber. This time, Megan is inside, seemingly lifeless. The doctor asks Megan to shut her eyes, but she is completely unresponsive. The doctor then sees Megan's eyes change, the same as Paige's. The woman in body lies unresponsive. Suddenly, a hole from under the machine reveals itself, and Megan's head gets sucked inside. A black web covers the walls of this hole until, eventually, they attach themselves to the doctor. The doctor struggles, but the webs force him down with them. The webs take him along with them, until they eventually reach the same pod as the ones the spiders crawled into. The doctor is stuck inside, and no one inside the clinic knows about this unforeseen abduction. Blake is pacing around his room, worried he might start seeing things again. The treatment even removed his need for a wheelchair. He sees one of the victims of the diner shooting, immediately followed by the shooter. The poor nab falls flat on his back and crawls out of the room. He finds himself in the room with the black mask. Blake notices the mask and reaches for it, with the lights constantly flickering. Blake enters a flashback, revealing that he is the masked shooter from that night. His flashback further shows that the damage to his brain resulted from an attempt to finish. Blake returns to his senses, now with the mask in his hands, as the black webs reach for his head and force the mask on his face. Sarah sees the electrician moving some supplies, as he mentions to Sarah that Megan is in the fear chamber. She wants to see her friend immediately, and the electrician eventually agrees after Sarah's constant nagging. The electrician takes her to the fear chamber, and the two then open the chamber to see the damage inside. Megan is unresponsive, so they escort her to a room with hospital beds for Osborne to examine her. Osborne looks at the body, realizing that Megan is essentially gone, but Sarah understands that Megan is in the same state as Paige before she passed away. Knowing that this is the case, she instructs Osborne to ensure that Megan's eyes are kept open at all times. Osborne examines the lifeless body before demanding that somehow someone get proper medical help. Apparently, everyone inside the clinic is stuck, as the windows are stuck shut with black tar and there is no signal reaching the house. Eventually, Sarah decides to look for supplies, but with the crew in dismay, no one understands the strange circumstances. The doctor is inside the pod still, covered in webs. He enters a hallucination, standing at the entrance of his office near the fear chamber. Inside, he finds Paige asking for help, eventually taking him to the same snow-covered plane again. The doctor realizes that the entity he is trying to counter has taken the form of Paige in his hallucination. The monster blames the doctor for reducing her food source, then starts approaching him. The monster in Paige's body reaches for his face, also causing a change in the real world. When she finally touches him, a monster pops out of the pod. This monster is now free to roam in the real world, donning a mask resembling the face of the doctor. Sarah reaches the doctor's office, where she finds a recorded tape. She plays the tape to see what the doctor believes their current predicament might be. The tape exposes the monster to be the literal embodiment of fear. The electrician is working on the electricity when he notices someone is behind him. He suspects it to be Bauer, but the shadowy figure does not respond to the electrician at all. Eventually, the electrician looks back and finally realizes that it is not Bauer behind him. Bauer is at one of the windows, trying to pry it open. Blake and the electrician are fighting by the electrical circuit. Bauer is trying to get through the tar covering the windows. In his efforts, the black liquid now covers his fingers. Blake takes out the electrician and retrieves his firearm, immediately firing around and alerting the others. Dylan tells Kaylee that they are in danger after hearing the gunshot. He demands that they both leave, but Kaylee seems to remain calm and questions how he thinks he will achieve such a feat. Dylan tries to throw a chair at a wall, but such a thoughtless effort yields no results as the two are still stuck inside. Bauer returns to Osborne and Megan, but Bauer seems out of it. He starts talking to himself, like Kaylee has been since she came to the Fear Clinic. He is talking to the monster, Fear. Back in their room, Kaylee starts talking about the monster as well. She mentions that the monster is approaching, suggesting that their end is near. Simultaneously, Bauer enters a state of mania. Kaylee also disappears. Kaylee and Bauer are now out and about. Kaylee approaches the monster from the pod, demanding that the monster reunite her with her brother according to his promise. The monster places its hand over her, causing her to go into a dream loop where she relives the diner incident repeatedly. Dylan tries to save her, but can only get the monster to detach from her before falling down the elevator shaft. Kaylee is now in the same state as Megan and Paige, a fear loop. Sarah is walking around the facility as she listens to the tape. Removing Fear from his patients has angered Fear, as it is losing its food source with the doctor's treatment. Osborne notices Fear across the window, thinking it is the doctor. The monster touches Osborne, sending her into a fear loop and feasting on her claustrophobia. Dylan is in the elevator shaft, alive. He gets up, but his legs have shattered. Regardless, he tries to get out. Sarah is climbing down a staircase, looking for the doctor. Suddenly, the masked shooter appears behind the door and points his firearm at Sarah. Sarah first kneels in compliance, but eventually runs away from the shooter. He follows after her, Blake succumbing to his necrophobia as he imagines himself shooting victims from the diner incident. Eventually, Sarah makes crawls away, but the masked shooter follows after. Blake reveals himself, and Sarah now realizes that Blake was never a victim, but the shooter himself. Blake stops to talk to Sarah. Sarah tries to talk him out of his mania, but Blake believes that the mask he is wearing is truly his identity as a person. Sarah is confused, as she does not see Blake wearing any mask, and eventually, Blake also realizes that he is not wearing one. The black liquid drips out of his eyes as Blake recalls a memory of his mother forsaking him for being a shooter. Sarah takes the opportunity and kicks Blake's shin, forcing him to the ground. Blake struggles for a bit, but Fear appears to take more victims. Sarah tries to save Blake, taking him away into the room with the hospital beds. The monster is still in pursuit, but Sarah eventually seats Blake by the bed, where he enters another state of fear. He enters the fear loop, now lying lifeless by the door. Sarah remembers the doctor's tapes about the fear loop and realizes that perhaps the one way to stop fear is by discarding those in the permanent cycle. This solution finishes the creature's source of power, so Sarah now knows what to do. She starts with Blake, closing his eyes and sending him to the next world. Sarah's solution is working, as the monster now begins to struggle. She then walks over to Osborne, bringing an end to her misery. Meanwhile, Dylan finds the gun as he slowly traverses the corridors with his crushed legs. Sarah then makes her way to Kaylee and ends her fear loop. Meanwhile, Dylan confronts the monster, ready to shoot with his gun. Sarah tries to reach for Megan, but Fear pulls in his remaining strength to stop her. Megan is in her fear loop while the monster prevents Sarah from ending its reign of Dylan sees the two of them struggling from the corridor and decides it is the end, using the gun on. Sarah can then reach for Megan's eyes, shut them, and finally discard Fear from reality. With everyone's eyes closed, the nightmare comes to a halt. The lights stop flickering, and the doctor is led out of the pod, fully naked. Sarah walks over to the doctor, the two being the only ones left. Fear had always wanted to seize the doctor, using the fear chamber as its door to him. The two now decide to prevent such an event in the future. They fire up the fear chamber one last time, with the doctor as the patient inside. Sarah initiates the process, now working to ensure the monster never makes it out and that Fear is never allowed to take more victims.